A huge welcome to everybody who's joined us for this Facebook Live conversation on What's New at AWID, Co-creating Feminist Realities. My name is Darkoa, Sekylamah, and I'm the Director for Information, Communications and Media at AWID. We're really excited to have everybody join us virtually. We wanted to share with you all what we've been working on at AWID since the beginning of the year. We started a new strategic plan entitled Co-creating Feminist Realities, and this framework will guide our work over the next 5 years. And I want to start by introducing you to a couple of my colleagues, and there are a lot more colleagues who are virtually participating in today's conversation. So on my right is Kimalee, who works with our Co-creating Feminist Realities team. Next to Kimalee is Ina, who works with our Building Feminist Economies team. On my left is Naureen, who works with the Advancing Universal Rights and Justice team. And next to Naureen is Kellea, who works with the Resource and Feminist Movements team. And there's so many more people behind the scene. And just to say, if you have a question for us at any point in time, please feel free to pop that in the comments box. It doesn't matter whether you are watching this live or if you watch this in a few months' time or even in a year's time. We will come back and answer any question that you have. We just want to be able to share with you some of what we're working on and will be working on over the next few years and how you can join us in this work that we do at AWID. So I want to start with you, Kimalee, because our strategic plan is entitled Co-creating Feminist Realities. What does it mean to co-create feminist realities? What are feminist realities?
Thank you, Nana. And it's a question I think that as an organization we're going to keep coming back to and visiting and revisiting as we build towards our forum in 2020. For us, we see feminist realities as this overarching term that captures the reclamation of our bodies, our lands, and our labor. We see feminist realities as processes in construction, but also living practices that center our humanity, our human rights, that center direct participation in democracy and justice in the context of community. So we're not pushing for individual rights per se, but we're pushing for collective rights, the enjoyment of collective rights. We're also talking about feminist realities as processes and spaces that center and prioritize joy, compassion, generosity, dignified lives. We also think about feminist realities as allowing for healing, collective and individual healing, and radical imagination. So feminist realities, they simultaneously defy systems of domination and oppression, but they also allow for bold, creative ideas to build the kinds of worlds that are just and that we know we deserve. We think of feminist realities as seeds of possibilities, but they can also be mature, grounded networks of trees that have been around for centuries, for months, for years, but that all work towards preserving our humanity and allowing us to survive and thrive, and also protecting our environment and our territories. So if I were to think of two concrete examples, I would use the example of there's a clinic that's run by sex workers in Mexico. And these sex workers have come together and they are selling condoms as a way to provide health care for their members. I think of the feminist government that was established by the Kurdish women's movement in northern Rojava, where they have decided this is what democracy looks like for them. This is what feminist governance looks like for them. And where they really rethink what it means to maintain and protect the public good, and to reimagine conversations around safety and security. So for us, I think that's some of what feminist realities means for us. And again, we look forward to continue to revisit this conversation because we know that feminist realities has to connect to the material conditions of the movements that we work with.
And in talking about the material conditions of the movements we work with, I think that leads nicely to the initiative that Ina leads, Building Feminist Economies. I mean, that sounds to me like something I want to be part of. What does that mean?
Thank you, Nana. Through I would say to see our feminist realities through, we need a few very basic things, right? We need clean water, we need food on the table, we need clean air to breathe. We need to have jobs that feel meaningful and dignified so that we feel that we are bringing use to the world. And these basic things are really what we understand, first of all, to be the economy, and not just tables and stock exchanges and markets and so on. And we understand that the global economic system as it is today, it does not meet these needs. It takes food and water away from the people, it pollutes the air and contaminates the water. It makes labor more and more precarious, and it erodes the power of the governments to protect their citizens by, for example, giving corporations enormous privileges and power through trade and investment agreements. And we have thousands of trade and investment agreements that protect corporations, but none to protect human rights from corporate abuse. And so it is clear to us as AWID, but also many of the partners and movements and feminists, that our struggle is not about integrating women in this failed economic model. And it is also not about economically empowering women to survive the destructive economy. So what we actually are doing is challenging the very basic assumptions and ideologies that drive the economy as it is today. What does it mean, for example, that we would challenge the ideology of profit as the highest value, or economic growth? That sounds like common sense, but actually means that more and more natural resources need to be exploited, and we know that economic growth can come with economic inequality, so maybe we actually need less growth. That's just an example of some of the feminine thinking about it. Now, ordinary people often feel that they don't understand enough about the economy, or they are not supposed to understand, especially if they are women. And it's important that we understand this exclusionary power of economics as a tactic that is intentional, that is about concentrating the power to decide on the economy in the hands of a few. And it's a power that we have to take back. So what we hope to see is more and more feminist and social movements, LGBTQI movements, and people taking the power to decide what is the economy that we want, and by that I mean how do we want to meet our basic needs, how do we want to use natural resources in a responsible way, and how we want to treat each other and the environment in that process. Now, I would say also that the concept of radical imagination that Kimalee brought up is really, really central to building feminist economies. Because the current economic model really tries very hard to convince us that this is the only possible, viable, reasonable scientific model. And we know this is not true, because we see in our work, in our life, in our movements and communities so many ways of economic transactions caring for each other that is not driven by profit but by care and solidarity. So the very act of envisioning and recognizing the economic practices that are not capitalist, that are not profit driven, and visioning new economic models is in itself a radical act of resistance. And so what we actually do within the Building Feminist Economies is, I would also say with one hand the visioning, and with other hand is challenging the corporate power and impunity. And we are doing this together because economy is about society.
And personally, I really identify with how, there's an idea that certain people, certain communities cannot speak about economies or understand economies. And I think for me what's really interesting about the work that we do as AWID is that it actually builds on a legacy of work we've been doing for decades. AWID is over 35 years old. And I remember, for example, at the 2012 AWID Forum in Turkey, the theme was really on economics, and for me it was like, wow, I had never really thought of this as a subject for feminists to engage with, so it's really powerful the way you framed that. But I also want to talk about how some of the current work you're doing really builds on years of work. So our work around advancing universal rights and justice stems from our Challenging Fundamentalisms program. So Naureen, can you speak to that and speak about the work of this new initiative?
Thank you, Hannah. No, I think absolutely. We've seen for the past at least 10 years, AWID has been focusing on, if we're speaking about particular systems of oppression and anti-rights actors, working on challenging fundamentalisms. And in fact, we see through the work we've done with the convenings, the surveys of our partners, of feminist activists and human rights defenders, the impact that we've been seeing, for instance, in one very widespread survey of feminist activists of fundamentalisms on the lives and the rights of women and sexually and gender non-conforming persons, for instance, included limited health rights, limitations in terms of sexual and reproductive rights, limitations in terms of access to the public sphere and political rights. And in a very real sense, we can all see step back right now, and we can see the ways in which fundamentalisms and fascisms and anti-rights, ultra-conservative, extreme movements of the right are on the rise. And in a sense, we can see the ways in which it's sort of the empire striking back against a lot of the feminist and progressive gains that our movements have been supporting and forwarding for some time. And so in terms of looking at how to respond, I think we want to pull out different threads. One area of AWID's work is looking at the ways in which anti-rights actors and movements are now taking these kinds of challenges and violence and discrimination to these rights that I was referring to, and now trying to strike at the heart of the rights protections themselves, the norms and the inbuilt mechanisms we have to actually be able to call for and push back against the violence and discrimination. So for instance, they're taking this directly to like the international human rights system and trying to undermine human rights. They're trying to co-opt the language of human rights and twist it, and a lot of this is a virtual reality. They're trying to twist it into kind of a parallel human rights scheme, which in fact embeds in impunity for state and non-state anti-rights actors. And it also tries to get human rights into some really fascinating and horrible sort of effect of actually supporting patriarchal, heteronormative, powerful, violent institutions. And I think that it's really key also to keep in mind in terms of the work we're doing and how we're supporting movements and organizing together, that we're dealing with interlocking oppressions. So now the Advancing Universal Rights and Justice Initiative is looking to push back and continue to work challenging fundamentalisms, as well as fascisms and authoritarianism. The links between them, the ways in which they're often fueled with, connected to corporate power, the fact that this in itself, the anti-rights actors and movements arise from a matrix of fundamentalisms, cultural, religious, market, the ways in which it's connected to and fueled by white supremacy, ultra-conservative nationalism and xenophobic nationalism, and rising inequity is really key in terms of how we might be able to organize and respond to it. So what I'd end by saying is that we're seeing, it's crucial to keep in mind that this is about systems of power, it's about interlocking oppressions, and also the understandings that we can respond to it of the ways in which these are very intentional. So we're seeing increasingly coordinated across different areas and also trying to transmit this transnationally, increasingly coordinated, powerful, and impactful fundamentalisms and fascisms, using different strategies and discourses which are echoed many times, like right to life, like the concept of gender ideology they've come up with, like the complete reframing of ideas of like religious liberty or cultural rights in order to exclude all of us from our own lived realities, in order to block feminist realities. So to look at the intentionality of that and the ways in which we can respond by organizing together, for instance, through multi-organizational initiatives like the Observatory on the Universality of Rights, to monitor and track, share information on the ways in which anti-rights movements are organizing against us to block feminist realities, and can come together across these kinds of fault lines in order to both disrupt in many different spaces to share our resistance strategies and to build on from those, and also in order to both protect and to grow and to feed feminist realities.
Thanks so much, Naureen. And I'm just reflecting on what you said about the rise and rise of the far right, and how that in itself, right, is an indicator of how successful feminist activism has been over decades. And we know that we need resources to fuel feminist movements. And one of the initiatives you lead, Kellea, I would say, builds on one of AWID's flagship programs. A lot of people will know us for our work asking the very fundamental question, where is the money for women's rights? Can you speak about the work of the Resource and Feminist Initiative?
Thank you. I feel inspired just listening to each of you already. But let's get real. To organize, we need money. We need resources. And we need to do it in ways that match our movements and our priorities and our politics. So if you're watching this online, and certainly if you're in the room because you're from AWID, then you know about our work looking at where is the money. Where is the money for feminist organizing? What we're doing with this initiative is also looking at how that money is matching up with the state of organizing at this current moment. And as Kimalee was describing, feminists are on the forefront of movements of all kinds. We have feminists leading within racial justice movements, Black Lives Matter. We have feminists who have always been central to movements for LGBTQI people. We have feminists leading within fights for land and climate justice. But the money isn't there. So not only are the resources for women's rights organizing and feminist organizing quite small, but especially where our movements are intersecting and connecting, we are getting a pittance. So just within the environmental case, we've learned recently that 0.2% of funding for environmental issues is going to the intersection of women's rights and the environment. 0.2%. We also know that within the human rights funding realm, we only have 25% that is going to women's rights and girls' rights. That means within this vast field where we know women and LGBTQI people are leading, we are not getting the resources. AWID's past research has shown that organizations, women's rights and feminist organizations, have an average budget of $20,000. Can you imagine what our world would look like if we were fully resourced? So what we're doing in this program within the initiative now is trying to understand, again, where can we advocate and access those funding. So that includes looking within spaces where, such as those that within the environment, human rights, where we can access more funding, but it also means trying to understand and push back against the kind of funding that goes against the transformations that we are trying to create. For us at AWID, that includes looking at the economic structures that undermine the feminist vision that we have for our future. It also means looking at where fundamentalisms are being funded and very effectively mobilized so that we can push back in those spaces. It also means understanding funding and resourcing as an ecosystem. Because while we might be getting some money from philanthropy, from development, from our own internal self-generated resourcing, we also have to understand that there is a lot of resourcing even from those same institutions, whether it's through investments or other arms of development, that are undermining our aims and trying to push for and advocate for coherence and shine a light on the entire field of resourcing to understand the small pressure points and the huge wins where feminist activism can push around resourcing and in our own organizing to match our needs and our movement's priorities.
Thank you so much. And for me, that's what is really scary. Because we know on one hand, so little money goes towards feminist movements, but there are some folks who have lots of money. So why do we have this inequality and what can we do about it? Ina, do you want to have a go at answering this question?
Yeah, well, that's a very big question, but I can do my best. I think it really brings up a lot of dilemmas that many feminist and women's rights organizations have. Because on the one hand, we don't have the resources and we don't have the proper resources and the flexible core funding that so many feminist organizations are lacking. At the same time, the private sector is more and more open to giving funds for social causes. I mean, I will not be naming specific brands, but I see all the time, all kinds of sports brands funding women's economic empowerment. We even saw some of the major technology giants condemning Trump's anti-migration policies. And this really brings questions on how do we understand the power structures in this world. Who's on the good side, who's on the bad side. And while on the local level, many women's rights organizations can deal with the dilemma of what do we do with private funding? Are we going to accept it if it's offered to us? Is it off the table because we understand that corporations are at the core of the system that oppresses us? But there are also the bigger questions of why is there so much money concentrated in the hands of corporations. And AWID research against the Solidarity Center a couple of years ago really showed that most of the wealth in the world is concentrated in the hands of corporations, not states. So even if we managed to organize as citizens to pressure states for adequate funding, they cannot do that. And so I would say it's really working on several levels and of asking also the very big questions of how wealth is generated, created, and distributed in our world on global, national, and local levels, and how we believe it should be.